Hello and welcome to our Bible study series in the book of Acts for summer 2026. This is a extra video, a bonus video, halfway through the Bible study series. We've had 2 months worth of recordings and study, and we've got another 2 months to go, and we've reached the last little paragraph in chapter 15, so we're about halfway through the book of the Acts of the Apostles, and so I just wanted to take stock and to look at where we've been and to think about some of the overarching narrative which we've read throughout the Acts of the Apostles. We've been delving deeply into some of the scenes and encounters that the apostles and those whom they've sent out on their behalf have encountered, but this is just a chance to look at the broader purpose of the Acts of the Apostles and what Luke is trying to say through it. Remember, Luke is writing to a community of Christians in Rome, but who are beginning to engage with the Roman authorities. His literature is finding a wider audience within Greek-speaking audiences in Rome, and so he does have something of an agenda, something of a purpose in writing, which we must be aware of as we're reading both his Gospel and the second part, the Acts of the Apostles. So Luke has to tell a story of how what was originally something of a biography of a miracle maker in Jerusalem and Galilee becomes a story about a God whom people are worshipping in Rome. And for a Rome-centric audience, for a Rome-centric empire, he's got to say, why did this individual who gathered a small following around him on the far reaches of the empire, in places where they've had to take censuses and send out governors to rule and to bring under their authority, how does this individual still have a following right across the empire of people who are starting to gain influence, starting to have structures and organisations which are exerting considerable influence and authority over society, over particular groups of people, and indeed within those who have positions of prominence within the empire itself. And so we've seen how at various points within the Acts of the Apostles, Luke introduces governors, Luke introduces proconsuls, Luke introduces individuals, officials of the Roman Empire, who respond to this invitation to follow Jesus. So Luke is already setting the ground for his readers to say it's okay to be an official of the Roman Empire and a follower of Jesus Christ. So there's also an explanation of why Jesus was of the Jewish religion, practiced Jewish faith, and then we've got a widespread group of followers who aren't following those rules. So that's why there's quite a focus on how that change comes about, how we go from a small group of Jewish disciples to a whole diversity of Gentile, of Greek, of Jewish, of all sorts of different religious followings. And we're beginning to see that as we've worked our way halfway through Acts play out. But Luke then has to say, why is this all one church? Why is this all one following? Why is this all one way of following one God and believing in and worshipping and praying to one God, when the religious background into which he's writing is a religion which is very quick to assimilate other revelations of the divine into its own pantheon, into its own way of understanding far-off gods who reveal themselves in particular encounters with individuals. But Luke wants to say that's not how Jesus operates. Jesus is something different. Jesus is God incarnate. Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary. That's why Luke's Gospel begins with this narrative of Jesus' human birth. He's not trying to make Jesus out to be another way in which a divine being takes over a human presence, as the Roman and Greek gods do sometimes, but actually Jesus is the very God incarnate, the Word made flesh. I know that's John's phrase, but that's how Luke presents it too. Luke does have ways in which the divine is revealed in particular instances, and Luke attributes those to angels. There was a question in the last Bible study about why it was an angel who sprang Peter from prison and not human authority. Well, Luke constantly uses angels. Notice they appear at the resurrection, they appear at the ascension, they appear at other times throughout the narrative as moments when the divine breaks into this human world which Jesus occupies. And that's nothing new. That's something that we know from Jewish texts. We know from the Old Testament. We know particularly from the historical books of the Old Testament that angels appear and bring revelations, bring messages to the people. So for Luke to introduce angels is not a strange or un-Christian thing to do or un-Jewish thing to do. Quite the opposite. It might be Luke trying to explain how there are ways in which we experience the divine which are not encounters with Jesus directly, but actually do have a real effect on the reality that we experience. Because then Luke can attribute other religious experiences which Greeks and Romans and Jews might bring to him to say, well, yes, there are other ways in which we can have revelations of the divine. But actually, to encounter Jesus is the real purpose of those encounters. And so when we're thinking about Paul's story, for example, it's not an angel Paul encounters, it's Jesus. Although there are other revelations involved in that story too, telling him to go and be baptized. So we have to be very careful, and you're absolutely right to pick up on it's important when Luke introduces human agency, when Luke brings angels into the story, when Luke says this is a miraculous encounter with Jesus Christ and the power of God himself. So Luke is working on all sorts of different levels in his storytelling and acknowledging that there are different ways in which we experience God's power and God's presence. But it is all to bring in this diversity of religious experience into something that Luke can say is one doctrine, one teaching of one church. So how does that spread happen? Well, let's just look at a couple of maps, because a pictorial representation might be helpful. So the first map I'm going to look at is of the apostles' early ministry, the first tier of apostles who were sent out by the church. Now remember, these are not the 12 apostles. They stayed, on the whole, very close to Jerusalem itself, because their learning from being with Jesus meant they had a particular role, a particular vocation, a particular calling to speak to the people around Jerusalem and Galilee. Peter made it as far as the coast, and some of the others made it as far as the coast to places like Lydda and Joppa, but they tended, in the first instance, to stay around Jerusalem. Instead, they handed the baton over. They consecrated through the power of the Holy Spirit others who would take that message further afield. And as we've read, the circles in which they operated started to spread slightly further. So here is marked Philip's ministry in black as he made his way down to Gaza, and then up the coast we have Azotus there, where he found himself after encountering the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8. And then he made his way up to Caesarea, further up the coast in Samaria. So you can see that Philip, and remember this isn't the Apostle Philip or the disciple Philip, this is one of that second group of apostles. I know it's confusing that we keep using apostle to mean different things. This isn't one of the 12, but this is that other Philip whom the 12 chose to send out in that second group of apostles. There was a question about that again in the Bible study most recently. I did refer to it in the video and say it wasn't Philip, one of the 12. Philip, one of the 12, his feast day is on the 1st of May in the Church of England calendar, and he's celebrated with James. And this reading from Acts 8 is never specified for that feast. Partly because Philip and James are celebrated together, so there's other focuses, partly because we need a reading from the Gospel, not just from other parts of the Bible, and partly because it's not the right Philip anyway. So that reading from Acts 8 is never set at morning, evening prayer or the Eucharist for Philip's feast day, the Philip, one of the 12's feast day, because it's a different Philip. The second tier of apostles, that Philip makes his way down through Judea and Samaria. So he does reach regions which are unfamiliar to Jewish practices. Samaria is seen as a sort of halfway house. They are considered Gentiles by most Jews in Jerusalem, but they maintain some Jewish practices and they maintain some of the literature which we are familiar with and which Jews would be familiar with. So Philip and some of that second group of apostles spread themselves out slightly further. If we look at where Paul ends up, we saw Paul travel further afield in the section of reading that we've just finished, which takes us up towards the end of chapter 15. Paul travels up to Antioch, which becomes a sort of a second significant central point of Christian authority and Christian gathering, particularly through Paul's ministry, but through others as well. And that carries on right through the early church. Antioch is a particularly significant place in the early church. And it's from Antioch that Paul first heads out by sea to Cyprus and then through to southern Turkey as we know it now. He makes his way inland into Turkey, then comes back to the coast and makes his way back by ship. It was easiest to travel around the Mediterranean by ship, and it wasn't unusual for you to pay to go aboard a merchant ship that was going to ports, and that's why places like Ephesus, like Athens and Corinth, like Syracuse and Ostium outside Rome became so significant because they were ports where ships docked, and a huge amount of trade went on, not just in goods but actually in people disembarking and getting on and off, and therefore in ideas, in thoughts, in conversations as well. And so we'll see Ephesus come up later and Athens. Notice that this map marks how John Mark returns to Jerusalem. He gets as far as Perga and the coast of Turkey, and then comes back and leaves Paul to travel inland into Turkey himself. And again, there's that sort of separation, that recognition that some of the apostles have a particular calling to be back around Judea and Jerusalem, and that's okay. But Luke also needs to explain and demonstrate how the faith was spread throughout the Mediterranean and throughout what he knew as the Roman Empire in particular. We're going to move on in our next set of Bible studies to look at Paul's other journeys, and we tend to focus more on Paul in this second half of the book of the Acts of the Apostles. Again, because Luke needs to demonstrate how that faith gets to Rome, and because he will have had conversations with Paul. And it's widely thought that Luke may actually have been Paul's scribe and had been the one to whom Paul dictated some of his letters for him to write them down. So there's a way in which we focus on Paul because that's the information that Luke had to hand, and Paul mentions Luke in some of his letters. He's not mentioned by name in the Acts of the Apostles, but Paul mentions him in some of his letters as a scribe, as someone whom he trusts with his letters. So if we look at this third map, we'll see how that widens now even further to include Rome itself in the top left-hand corner of the map, and you see how Paul's third missionary journey takes him eventually right across the sea past Crete and Malta, and we'll see how he's shipwrecked on Malta, taking him right across to Rome. So in fact this is a map of Paul's journeys. It's also a map of ancient shipping routes across the Mediterranean. This is how goods and ideas were shared throughout the ancient Mediterranean, and that was normal, and people documented those sorts of journeys and what they found on their way. So for a Greek-speaking audience, a Greek-reading audience, this would have been absolutely the sort of storytelling that they were familiar with. And Luke capitalizes on that and uses it to tell his Christian story. So I just wanted to pause and give you a bonus video for this Bible study, because there's been a lot to get out of the book of Acts, and I'm really pleased with how the reading and the Bible studies in person have gone, and you've come with lots of excellent questions. So I just wanted to take stock, to answer some of those questions from the last Bible study, and to look more broadly at what the purpose and the narrative thrust of the Acts of the Apostles is. So look forward to our next video, picking up Acts 15:36 onwards, and what happens to Paul and the other apostles next. Thank you for staying with us. I hope you're enjoying it and finding how God is at work in the world through your reading, your study, your prayer, and your discipleship. Thank you.